December 1942, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The humid air reeked of gasoline and jungle rot as Japanese pilots lounged in the shade of their Zero fighters. They pointed skyward at a strange silhouette lumbering across the horizon, a plane with wings bent downward, like some awkward seabird struggling to take flight. They laughed. The Americans, it seemed, had built a joke of a warplane. The Vought F-4U Corsair, instantly nicknamed the Bent Wing Bird. Its unusual inverted gull wings looked more like a design accident than the spearhead of American aviation. To the enemy, it was laughable. To many in the U.S. Navy, it was questionable. The Corsair was fast, yes, but it bounced on carrier decks like a wild bronco. Pilots struggled to land it without wrecking. Ground crews complained about maintenance. Commanders wondered if it was worth the trouble. Yet appearances deceive. What those Japanese pilots didn't realize as they chuckled beneath the Pacific sun was that this awkward-looking fighter carried the most powerful engine of its time, and a speed advantage that would soon flip the balance of the skies. Here lies the paradox. How could a warplane mocked at its birth, rejected by its own navy, and feared by its own pilots become the terror of the Pacific? How did the Corsair transform from clumsy misfit into the most lethal aircraft American aviators would ever fly against Imperial Japan? The answer is not simple. It is a story of design genius and deadly flaws, of brutal trial by fire in the jungles and waters of the Pacific. It is a story of men who learned to tame a beast, and in doing so, unleashed a legend. For the Japanese, the laughter would not last long. In the months ahead, those same pilots who once mocked the gull-wing bird would watch in horror as their beloved Zero, the pride of their empire, was shredded from the sky by a fighter. They once dismissed as laughable, but how did this happen? How did a machine once considered too dangerous for its own pilots rewrite the rules of aerial combat? To understand how ridicule turned into fear, to understand how laughter became screams in the clouds, we need to go back to the drawing boards of the 1930s, back to the minds of engineers who dared to build something no one had ever seen before. And it all began with a question. What if we built the fastest fighter the world had ever known? 1938. The Pacific Ocean stretched like a vast chessboard. The U.S. Navy faced a sobering truth. It was falling behind. Across the seas, Japan was building faster, lighter, more agile aircraft, planes like the Mitsubishi A6M0 that promised to dominate the skies. If war ever came, America's carriers needed something revolutionary, something faster, tougher, deadlier. Vought Aircraft stepped forward with a bold proposal. Their idea was as radical as it was risky. Take the largest, most powerful engine ever mounted on a single-engine fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, and build a frame around it. This was no ordinary engine. With 18 cylinders arranged in a twin row, it roared with over 2,000 horsepower, more than enough to push a warplane to speeds that had only been dreamed of. But power came at a cost. The Double Wasp was enormous, so large that fitting it onto a compact fighter required ingenuity, bordering on madness. To house the massive propeller, engineers needed clearance from the ground. The solution? An inverted gull wing, bent downward then up again, allowing shorter landing gear while still providing room for the massive propeller arc. It was unconventional. It was strange, but it worked. The result looked unlike anything else in the sky. Sleek fuselage, a nose so long it seemed to swallow the horizon, and those unmistakable wings curving downward like the limbs of a great seabird. Test pilots who first laid eyes on it called it ugly. Engineers called it innovative. And the Navy, desperate for speed, called it necessary, and speed it delivered. During early trials, the XF-4U-1 prototype shattered expectations, becoming the first American single-engine fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. Headlines proclaimed it a marvel. The Navy believed it had found its champion, a warplane that could finally outmatch the Zero in both speed and climb. But innovation rarely comes without flaws. The Corsair's long nose created a dangerous blind spot, making landings treacherous. Pilots struggled to see the carrier deck until the last second. The landing gear, though shortened by the bent wings, proved fragile, prone to bouncing the aircraft violently back into the air, earning the Corsair the reputation of a deck killer. And there was more. That powerful engine vibrated so fiercely it rattled instruments loose. The cockpit, cramped and overheated, wore down even the toughest men. On paper, the Corsair was unstoppable, its climb, dive, and raw speed unmatched by anything in the Pacific. But for the men who sat behind its stick, the experience was far more terrifying. The Navy had asked for a champion. Instead, they found themselves staring at a beast. The brass faced a dilemma. Could this monster ever be tamed for carrier operations? Or had Vaught's engineers created a warplane too dangerous to field? For the moment, the Corsair was grounded. Too wild for carriers, too unpredictable for the very mission it was built to serve. And yet wars are not fought on paper. They are fought in the skies, over jungles, oceans, and burning ships. The Navy could shelve the Corsair, but the Marines, facing desperate battles ahead, saw something else, a weapon worth mastering. No matter the cost, because if the Corsair's flaws could be beaten, if men could learn to ride the wild Bronco, the Pacific might yet belong to America. On paper, the Corsair was unbeatable. But in the cockpit, it was a disaster waiting to happen. 40. Stratford, Connecticut. On the runway outside Vaught's factory, the first Corsair prototype sat gleaming in the morning sun. The engineers watched with pride as the giant propeller spun to life, its roar shaking the ground. This was the future, the plane that would outpace the Japanese Zero, the fastest fighter America had ever built. But pride would soon give way to dread. The Corsair's first flight hinted at its brilliance. It climbed like a rocket. It dove like a hawk. Speed flowed from its massive engine in a way no American pilot had ever felt. But landing was another story. The problem was obvious the moment the test pilot lined up with the runway. The nose stretched so far forward it seemed to blot out the earth itself. As the pilot descended, he couldn't even see the strip of concrete below him. He flared too high, slammed down hard, and the plane bounced violently back into the air. Metal screeched. Tires tore. Somehow the Corsair skidded to a stop in one piece. But everyone watching knew this was not a one-off mistake. Test after test confirmed it. The Corsair's landings were brutal, unpredictable, and often fatal. Pilots came back shaken, hands trembling as they unstrapped from the cockpit. The Navy had asked for speed and Vought had delivered. But in solving one problem, the designers had created another. A fighter so unstable it killed its own men before it ever met the enemy. Carrier trials only made the humiliation worse. On the rolling decks of Navy flat tops, the Corsair bucked and leapt like a wild stallion. One pilot crashed so violently the landing gear punched through the wings. Another slammed into the barriers, nearly killing the crew on deck. The brass could only watch as their wonder plane chewed through pilots and aircraft alike. By 1941, the verdict was in. The U.S. Navy declared the Corsair unsuitable for carrier operations. The headlines that once praised the fastest fighter in American history now carried a different tone. Skepticism, even ridicule. The bent wing bird was fast, yes, but what good was speed if you couldn't bring the plane home? The humiliation stung. A design meant to win the skies was now grounded. Instead of being America's savior, the Corsair looked like a failure. A costly experiment better left in hangars, and word of its troubles spread. Across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence whispered the story to their pilots. America's new fighter was a dud. The Zero still ruled. At Rabaul, Truk, and Tokyo, laughter echoed once more at the strange bent-wing machine. The enemy's mockery grew sharper. They called it dangerous not to them, but to the Americans who dared to fly it. For the U.S. Navy, the Corsair was a dead end. They turned to other designs, other fighters that might better suit their carriers. The bent-wing bird was shoved aside, its wings folded not for combat, but for storage. But war has a way of finding use for every weapon. While the Navy washed its hands of the Corsair, the Marine Corps faced a desperate shortage of fighters. The war in the Pacific was intensifying. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Bougainville. The Marines didn't have the luxury of waiting for perfection. To them, the Corsair's flaws were frightening, but its promise was undeniable. They needed firepower. They needed speed. They needed something, anything that could go toe-to-toe with the Zero. So while the Navy shelved the bird, the Marines prepared to saddle it. And in the jungles and coral atolls of the Pacific, they would discover what no one else had seen. This beast still had untapped potential. February 1943. The Solomon Islands. The Pacific War was grinding, brutal, and far from decided. On the island of Guadalcanal, Marines dug into muddy foxholes as the jungle roared with insects, artillery, and the whine of Japanese aircraft circling above. The Zero still ruled these skies. America's exhausted forces needed something, anything that could fight back with teeth. Into this chaos came the first squadrons of F-4U Corsairs. Painted in dark oceanic blue, they looked every bit as strange as the Japanese had mocked. Bent wings, hulking nose, wide propeller spinning like a saw blade. Pilots who climbed into them knew the risks. Landing was still a nightmare. Mechanical quirks could betray them at any moment. But once airborne, the Corsair revealed a side that no test report could fully capture. It was fast, unbelievably fast. When a Corsair pushed its throttle forward, the nose kicked, the engine thundered, and the horizon blurred into a streak. Pilots described it as strapping themselves to a wild animal. Dangerous, yes, but exhilarating. And when its .650 caliber Browning machine guns opened fire, the sky erupted in streams of lead. The Corsair didn't just nip at its prey. It tore holes straight through it. The Japanese Zero was nimble, light and graceful, a dancer in the clouds. But against the Corsair, it was suddenly outclassed in ways its pilots had never imagined. In a turning dogfight, the Zero still held the edge, weaving and looping tighter than the heavy American fighter. But speed changes everything. When a Corsair dove, the Zero couldn't follow. When it climbed, the Zero lagged behind. The Corsair was a blunt instrument, but in the hands of Marines desperate for survival, that bluntness became a weapon all its own. The first clashes were chaotic. Some Marines cursed the plane, fighting its long nose and stubborn landings. Others came back pale, shaken by how close they had come to losing control. But mixed with the frustration was something new, a flicker of hope. Because for every landing accident, there was a Japanese Zero trailing smoke into the sea. For every pilot who limped home with a dented wing, there was another who returned grinning, claiming his Corsair had outrun and outgunned the enemy. Reports began filtering back. The bent-wing bird was no pushover. It was a hammer, and in the crucible of the Solomons, Marines were learning how to swing it. They flew it low, where speed mattered more than agility. They learned to dive through enemy formations, unleash torrents of gunfire, and then claw back into the clouds before the Zero could react. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't graceful, but it was working. And then came the battle that would change everything. A single clash that would silence the laughter of Japanese pilots, and prove beyond doubt that the Corsair was not the clumsy joke they had once mocked. Because in that fight, the bent-wing bird would finally earn its name as the scourge of the Pacific skies, April 1943. The skies above the Solomons shimmered with heat and smoke. Below, the islands burned with artillery and naval gunfire. Above, the duel for air supremacy raged on. And it was here, in these tropical killing grounds, that the Corsair shed its reputation as a joke and became a predator. The first Marine squadrons, hardened by weeks of brutal combat, had learned the Corsair's secret. You didn't dogfight the Zero. You didn't try to turn with it. That was suicide. Instead, you fought differently. You fought vertically. Marine pilot Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, one of the first Corsair aces, described the lesson clearly. You had to use your speed. If you turned with a Zero, you were finished. But if you climbed, if you dove, if you fought in the vertical, you had him beat every time. And so they did. Walsh's Corsair streaked into a formation of Zeros, .650 calibers spitting fire. One Zero exploded in mid-air, its wings shearing off as it tumbled into the sea. Walsh didn't linger. He yanked back on the stick, climbing like a rocket. The Zeros clawed after him, but their engines couldn't keep pace. At the top of his climb, he rolled, dove again, and ripped apart a second enemy fighter before disappearing back into the clouds. These were not isolated victories. Marine pilots began racking up kill streaks, sometimes 3, 4, even 5 enemy planes in a single sortie. The Corsair's combination of speed, dive power, and sheer firepower was rewriting the playbook of Pacific air combat. Japanese pilots were stunned. For years they had dominated the skies, confident that the Zero's agility made it untouchable. But now the bent-wing monster cut through them with brutal efficiency. It didn't dance. It didn't duel. It struck like a hammer, fast, furious, and final. Reports from Japanese squadrons tell the story of their growing dread. Pilots who once laughed at the Corsair began warning each other. Avoid head-on passes. Don't try to chase it in a dive. Never get caught below one. The laughter had turned to whispers of fear. One Japanese officer, after a clash over Bougainville, admitted grimly, "This is not the Hellcat. This is something else. This one is faster, stronger. We cannot match it in the climb." The Marines felt the shift as well. For the first time, they were not just surviving dogfights, they were dominating them. The Corsair was still dangerous to fly, still brutal to land, but in the air it had no equal. Each kill streak fed the legend. Pilots painted kill tallies beneath their cockpits, names like Walsh, Boyington, and Blackburn becoming symbols of a new era in the Pacific War. The Zero, once feared as invincible, was being humbled by a warplane the enemy had mocked as a failure. And yet, this was only the beginning. The Solomons were a proving ground, but the Pacific was vast, and the bloodiest skies still lay ahead. Truk Lagoon, the Marianas, Okinawa. The Corsair's reputation was growing, its kill ratios climbing higher with each clash. But no one yet knew just how far this bent-wing bird would soar, or how terrifying it would become to those who once laughed at it. Because the Pacific's deadliest battles were still to come, and the Corsair was only sharpening its claws. By late 1943, the bent-wing bird had shed its awkward beginnings. In the hands of ordinary pilots it was dangerous, but in the hands of masters it became something else entirely, a weapon of myth. And no name embodied that transformation more than Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. Boyington was larger than life. A Marine Corps pilot with a swaggering confidence and a reputation for bending rules, he seemed as untamable as the Corsair itself. When handed command of a ragtag unit of misfits, VMF 214, soon to be known as the Black Sheep Squadron, he turned them into the stuff of nightmares for Japanese aviators. The Black Sheep flew their Corsairs with reckless brilliance. Boyington taught his men not to fear the Corsair's quirks, but to embrace them. They dove at impossible angles, used their speed to slash through enemy formations, and relied on raw aggression to overwhelm opponents. Where the Zero danced gracefully, the Corsair punched brutally. Boyington and his squadron proved that air combat wasn't about elegance. It was about dominance. The results were staggering. In just 12 weeks of combat, the Black Sheep shot down or destroyed nearly 100 Japanese aircraft. Boyington himself claimed kill after kill, climbing toward what would eventually be 28 confirmed victories. His men, once dismissed as misfits, became national heroes, the subject of newsreels and headlines. Japanese pilots began to describe the Corsair squadrons in almost supernatural terms. Reports intercepted after battles referred to them as devils with wings. The dark blue fighters seemed to appear out of nowhere, swooping from the clouds with terrifying speed, spitting fire, and then vanishing before the stunned survivors could react. This was psychological warfare as much as physical. For the first time, Japanese pilots entered combat already burdened with fear. The laughter that had once greeted the bent-wing bird had long since vanished. Now the very sight of those curved wings on the horizon sent a chill through enemy cockpits. But mastering the Corsair was more than just flying it well. It was about rewriting the rules of air combat. Marine squadrons developed tactics built entirely around the plane's strengths, fighting vertically, diving through formations, hitting hard, and escaping before the Zero could retaliate. The Corsair didn't need to match the Zero's agility. It only needed to exploit its power and speed. And in the hands of pilots like Boyington, Blackburn, Walsh, and their squadrons, it became unstoppable. Yet for all its triumphs in the island-hopping campaigns, the Corsair still faced a looming challenge. It had proven itself over jungles and atolls where rough airstrips gave it room to run. But the Navy had not forgotten its earlier failures. The Corsair had yet to conquer the tight, rolling decks of the aircraft carrier, the very battlefield it was born to rule. And until it did, its reign in the Pacific skies remained incomplete. For years, the Corsair had fought with one hand tied behind its back. It was faster than anything in the Pacific, deadlier in the dive, unmatched in the climb. But there was one battlefield it could not yet dominate. The very heart of American naval power, the aircraft carrier. When the war began, the Navy had dismissed the Corsair as too dangerous for carrier landings. Its long nose blinded pilots on approach. Its landing gear, designed for strength, was stiff, bouncing the plane across the deck like a bucking bronco. Worse still, the Corsair had a vicious tendency to stall its left wing at low speeds. One mistake, one bad angle, and a young pilot could end up in the ocean. The Navy, burned by early accidents, gave up on the fighter, and so for nearly 2 years, the Corsair was confined mostly to island airstrips. Handed off to the Marine Corps, the Navy relied instead on its safer but slower Wildcats and Hellcats. But as the war dragged on, pressure mounted. The Marines had proven what the bent-wing bird could do. The Navy wanted its speed, its firepower, its ability to strike deep. And so, engineers and test pilots went back to the drawing board. Step by step, the Corsair was reshaped for carrier duty. The landing gear was strengthened, and adjusted for smoother compression. A longer tailwheel strut lifted the nose slightly, improving the pilot's forward view. The tailhook was re-engineered for a firmer, more forgiving grab of arrestor wires. Even the pilots themselves were retrained, forced to relearn carrier landings with entirely new techniques. Instead of the straight-in approach used with other fighters, Corsair pilots were taught to curve in from the side. This way, they could keep the deck in view until the last possible moment. It was unorthodox, it was risky, but it worked. By early 1944, after countless hours of redesign and practice, the Navy finally gave its blessing. The Corsair was cleared for carrier operations. The very fighter it had once rejected would now be deployed en masse across the Pacific. The timing could not have been better. The war was entering its most brutal phase. American fleets were pressing closer and closer to Japan. The battles ahead, Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, would require fighters that could dominate the skies and strike with crushing force. And now at last the Navy had such a weapon. From the decks of Essex-class carriers, the Corsair leapt into the air, its bent wings catching the light of the Pacific sun. It was fast, it was lethal, and it carried with it the lessons of every crash, every burned landing, every sacrifice that had forged it into a carrier killer. The fighter once spurned was now the Navy's sharpest blade, a machine no longer feared by its own pilots, but by its enemies, and just in time, for the skies over Japan would soon be the deadliest battleground of them all. Spring 1945. The skies over Okinawa burned with smoke, tracer fire, and the deafening roar of engines. The Pacific War had reached its fiercest crescendo. The Japanese, cornered and desperate, unleashed everything they had. Kamikaze pilots screaming down from the clouds, Zero squadrons defending their homeland with ruthless precision, and an endless barrage of anti-aircraft fire from ships and shore batteries. It was chaos, death, and fire all at once. And into this hellstorm, the Corsair soared. For the men of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, the Corsair was no longer a wild, unpredictable machine. It had been tamed, mastered, and perfected over thousands of combat hours. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns could shred a kamikaze plane before it reached the fleet. Its rugged airframe could absorb hits that would have crippled lesser fighters, and its massive engine, roaring at full throttle, gave pilots the speed to climb above the fray, dive through formations, and escape intact. Pilots recounted terrifying scenes, flocks of kamikazes diving in coordinated waves, anti-aircraft shells bursting in clouds around them, and Zeros looping desperately to intercept. Amid it all, Corsair pilots remained calm, relying on the lessons learned over the Solomons and the Marianas. They attacked with precision, their vertical tactics tearing apart enemy formations and leaving survivors in stunned disbelief. One veteran, Captain Joe Foss, described the feeling in the cockpit. You were in the middle of a storm of fire, but the Corsair gave you the edge. You could fight back, strike fast, and get out. It was a machine built for survival and destruction at the same time. The statistics confirmed what pilots felt in the air. By war's end, Corsairs had achieved astonishing kill ratios against Japanese aircraft. 11 enemy planes destroyed for every loss of a Corsair. Across the Pacific, wherever the bent-wing bird appeared, the Japanese knew fear. Entire squadrons hesitated, formations broke under the weight of its attack, and the once proud Zero found itself outmatched. The Corsair's dominance was not just mechanical, it was psychological. Japanese pilots, who had once sneered at the ugly American fighter, now spoke of it with dread. Its combination of speed, firepower, and durability created an aura of invincibility. Kamikaze pilots learned that a head-on attack against a Corsair was nearly suicidal. Anti-aircraft gunners realized that the plane could shrug off damage that would have grounded others. And yet, even in victory, the battles were harrowing. Many Corsairs returned scarred by enemy fire, bearing shrapnel, torn wings, and bullet-riddled fuselages. Pilots pushed the machines to the edge of their limits, surviving feats that seemed impossible. Each sortie was a gamble, a clash of human courage and mechanical genius against desperation and death. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific was a transformed theater. The Corsair, once mocked and grounded, now dominated the skies. Its legacy was written in smoke trails, shredded enemy aircraft, and the voices of men who had faced the war's deadliest challenges, and survived. The war was ending, but the Corsair's story was far from over. The guns fell silent in 1945, But the story of the bent-wing bird did not end with the surrender of Japan. The F-4U Corsair continued to soar, proving that its genius and ferocity was not confined to a single war. When the Korean War erupted, the Corsair returned to the skies, this time facing jet-powered adversaries in the early age of supersonic combat. Against these new threats, the Corsair's rugged design and immense firepower gave it an edge. In what would become a historic moment, Corsair pilots scored the last documented kills by a piston-engine fighter against enemy jets. A plane once mocked as a clumsy experiment had evolved into a machine capable of matching the new era of aviation. Allies around the world came to admire it. Its speed, durability, and firepower became benchmarks for fighter design. Enemy pilots, those who had once laughed at the gull-winged oddity, admitted their grave miscalculations. Japanese veterans, reflecting decades later, acknowledged the deadly potential they had underestimated. The laughter that once echoed over Pacific airfields had long since turned to a grudging respect, even fear. The Corsair's place in history was secured not just by its victories, but by the lessons it embodied. It became a symbol of innovation pushed to extremes, of human courage in the face of technological risk, and of the hidden potential lurking in what first appears flawed. Its legacy reminds us that triumph often lies where doubt once reigned, and that greatness is rarely obvious at first glance. From laughter to legend, the Corsair carved its name in blood and steel. But what does its journey really tell us about war? The Pacific sun dips low over the horizon. The bent wings of the F-4U Corsair catch the last light, silhouetted against the endless sea. For decades, this strange, awkward-looking fighter has symbolized something far greater than steel and gunpowder. It represents the hidden potential that often lies where the world least expects it. The Corsair's story is a study in innovation born from failure. Its earliest days were riddled with accidents, rejected designs, and skepticism from the very men it was meant to serve. It was laughed at, dismissed, even feared. Yet each flaw was a lesson, each crash a step toward mastery. Engineers refined it, pilots adapted, and slowly, the clumsy bent-wing bird transformed into one of the deadliest machines the world had ever seen. Ridicule often masks potential. The Japanese pilots who sneered at the Corsair could not have imagined its lethal evolution. The Navy that once grounded it had no choice but to embrace it. And the Marines, courageous and persistent, proved that human skill and determination could unlock the full power of an imperfect creation. The Corsair teaches us that greatness is rarely obvious at first glance, and that the most important strengths are often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for those bold enough to discover them. As the war drew to a close, the Corsair stood as a monument to adaptation under fire. It was more than metal and engine. It was a testament to resilience, to the triumph of ingenuity, and to the courage of those who dared to fly a machine that many said could not be tamed. History remembers the victories, the kill streaks, the pilots who etched their names into legend, but the lessons extend beyond the battlefield. And so, the bent-wing bird rests, its wings silhouetted against the Pacific sunset. Once mocked, once feared by its own, it soared beyond expectation and ruled the skies. A reminder that the improbable, the underestimated, and the initially scorned can, in the right hands, become unstoppable. The bent-wing bird was never supposed to fly, but once it did, it ruled the skies.